Oklahoma. Langston University had a school built 2 years. She litigated, went through all the courts. Finally, Oklahoma said, okay, we'll build you a school. Had it up and running in 2 weeks. She was eventually admitted to University of Oklahoma at Norman, along with, after sweat, after the court said it's not comparable. The school that you're building is not comparable. So she's got 2 little stories. One is her brother came out of the military, went to law school, finished law school while her litigation was going on. So that was the issue that Viola Johnson faced. Do I litigate or do I go to school? So she opted to litigate. She eventually was admitted to the University of Oklahoma at Norman. So the other funny story is that when she was admitted to University of Norman, Oklahoma decided that they would have internal segregation. So they had a sign in front of the seat, and they said, this is the colored section. And so she sat behind that sign for 1 day. The next day, the sign was somewhere else. Her classmates were just moving it all over the classroom to make the point that it was ridiculous. Her experience was very, very different than George McLaughlin. He was admitted into University of Oklahoma School of Education, and he was, in fact, segregated. They managed to find an alcove so that if this is the classroom, there's like a corner over here that he could sit in. So he was not in the same room with everybody, although there was no door separating him. He was actually in a different room. Cafeteria, he had his own table where he ate by himself. He managed to finish. He got his PhD despite that kind of isolation that he experienced. Okay, so there's litigation going on all over the country, started by Hamilton, Houston. In Louisiana, at this time in the 40s, our Supreme Court took the summers off. So if your case didn't get up before May, or probably before February or March, then it wouldn't be heard until the next fall. If we hadn't had that rule, then we'd be reading about Hatfield instead of Sweat. They had identical cases, it's just the timing of reaching the Supreme Court. We'd be reading about Hatfield. Louisiana would wait until after Sweat versus Pan. Roy Wilson was our case that desegregated LSU in 1950. First graduate is Ernest Morial, and right behind him, Robert Collins. They entered together. Morial wanted to be first, so he studied extra hard so he could get out early. This is the response to Hatfield. We have this committee, State Board of Education, Board of Supervisors, LSU does not include anybody from Southern. Making decisions about Hatfield because he raised the demand. So the demand is very interesting. They're noting the Gaines case. Aber said you can't come to our school, but he was aware of the Gaines case, and he knew that his position was not tenable. He was just, I don't know, didn't want to lose his job, or knew that desegregating the school at that point would not be acceptable. So we've got Gaines, we've got a demand, we have to do something, we have 3 choices. He also noticed he's apparently qualified for admissions to law school at LSU. And so a lot of times people say, affirmative action, you're getting lower candidates. No, he was qualified. He just put down that he was a graduate of Xavier. If he hadn't done that, he might have been going to school there. Nobody would know. So they decide that they're going to create a law school at Southern University, and the staff and faculty at LSU are going to help. Just a timeline, the plan is approved, and they did help, okay? So the faculty, 8 or 10 faculty members at LSU would come to Southern to teach the civilian courses, and they would also teach the professors to enable the professors to ultimately teach those civilian courses. Remember, no blacks had been educated in Louisiana since 1886, so there was nobody who knew that material. Okay, but they did come and teach the professors. Plans approved in January. Hatfield Smith now moot. We had 3 choices. We opted for the separate but equal. The school opens with 4 faculty and 13 students, professors teaching 6 graduates. Their classes were held in the library, in the university library. But it was a sectioned off area. It wasn't borrowed space. It was space dedicated to the law center. But by 1953, they had their old building, which is the building that now houses the moot courtroom. So that's the 1953 moot courtroom that's been updated twice since I've been here. Who knows how many times I've done that. And also provisional approval by ABA. ABA has standards, and if you purport to meet those standards, you can be provisionally approved, and then they come in and they do a second inspection until you get your final approval. The law center is designated law center, which gives it separate administrative authority over its money, which has been wonderful in these times of cutbacks. And I think it was 2011. I couldn't remember if it was 2011 or 2010. By the time the Southern University Law Center had celebrated its 50th anniversary in 1997, Glenn Labby, a student here, had located Charles Hatfield. So Charles Hatfield was invited to attend the celebration and received a plaque. And that's when I started writing about him. I was able to interview him, and Glenn Labby also was able to interview him. We both recorded our interviews, and they are in the library at this point. So if you want to hear interviews of Hatfield's voice, they're in the library at this point. Okay, so next slide, push the button. We also were able, as a school, to honor him by giving him the first honorary degree from Southern University Law Center, which I thought was an appropriate recognition for his contribution to its existence. It wasn't my idea, but when someone suggested that, I did not know, the person who suggested it did, I did not know that at that point he was dying of cancer. So he died about 3 weeks after he received his honorary degree. So I'm finished. If you have questions, you can ask me questions. I can look them up in my book. Yes.
My question, I guess, is why did Mr. Hatfield not enroll back when the school was established?
At Southern.
Yes.
2 reasons. One, he didn't want to go to a separate but equal school. He wanted to desegregate. He wanted his legacy to be desegregation, and he failed at that. So he gave up. The other reason was that while he was litigating, he received all this hate mail, and people would call him in the middle of the night, and he said he was very fortunate that he lived in the middle of the Lafitte housing project so that nobody could get to him physically or throw things into his windows. So he, I guess, had, I don't know, but maybe now we would call it burnout maybe. He eventually went to Atlanta and got a master's degree in education. He came back to Louisiana, and when Loyola decided to desegregate it, they invited him to enroll there. And he did enroll. I think he stayed for almost a semester. And then he decided that he was too old, he had too many kids, and too many financial responsibilities. So he did never enroll in law school. Any other questions?
Yes. So back, if you go back to where, in your slides where it shows that the law school came to existence in 1947. Ernest Morial graduated from LSU in 1954. Ernest Morial never came to law school here. Right. So he stayed at LSU and continued to graduate at LSU. But my point is, there was no effort by Southern University to have a black law school before LSU made efforts to try to create a way in which to remove black students from their law school. In other words, if LSU had not been forced to try to integrate, then Southern would have never had a black law school.
So the point that I made about the state not willing to put out any money until there's a demand for the service. So even though Southern was authorized to have a law school, nobody had demanded that.
And they had never made an effort to have a law school.
And so the university did not take it upon itself to create a law school. I mean, again, the money was very tight. When you compare the budgets of LSU to the budgets of Southern throughout the years,
It's criminal.
the numbers are just so fantastic. You know, 10,000 versus 1 million kind of numbers. You know, it's just crazy. So I can understand Clark not incurring the cost when there was no demand.
That was what I was gonna talk about, the $10,000 how they started it. I'm good.
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned there was 3 acceptable methods. Once the Supreme Court overturned the rule that you could send students or pay for their out-of-state tuition, correct?
Right.
All right. And they overruled it in what, 1938?
38.
Okay, because I've known people even after 38 where apparently states were still doing that even after that.
Sure, as
Okay.
recently as in the 60s.
Yes.
Well, 70s, I think even in the 70s. There's a judge in Virginia who had her tuition subsidized for her to attend law school outside of the state.
Recently, someone called from South Carolina, and they wanted to know how many judges we had that graduated from Southern University Law Center. And it was because they closed down at a certain point. And they were trying to figure out, because we had so many black leaders that had graduated through the law center, how they had actually been stifled in that state because they did not have that type of leadership being nurtured. And it was very good as they.
So they were doing a comparison of not, yeah, so I mentioned that in my book, that many of these, I think there might have been 17 law schools, black law schools, or black law schools attached to historically black universities. There might have been 17 of them at one point, and now there are 5 because Florida recently added back its law school. So Florida's story is interesting. They were one of the states that had a law school attached to its historically black university, and then the university admitted a white student. So 3 years later, they closed the school. You know, after that student was admitted, they didn't allow any more first-year students, and then when that student graduated, they closed the school.
My question was, in connection, because I've always wondered this, I know that Texas Southern came up right about at the same time as Southern. I was wondering, Mr. Turo and his co-counsel that were working on Mr. Hatfield's case, were they in contact with the people doing the litigation in Texas and in other places in the country?
I would argue that Charles Hatfield Houston was the epicenter. Okay, so he died in 46, I think. So that became now Thurgood Marshall. So when a person comes to you and says, you know, I want to desegregate whatever, instead of starting from scratch, you could call up Marshall and say, could you send me a pleading for this kind of thing? You know, and you call them up and you say, well, what do you do? I got these kinds of responses. How do I respond? So rather than having like 100 different counsel that worked for the NAACP, he had coordinate counsel. What did he call them?